and welcome to this special episode of the FIZ show. In this particular episode, we have a special guest who is a representative of a very interesting and forward-looking organization. One of the things that at Financial Insight we love to do is obviously bridge new ground. And for the first time on our show, we will be looking at the recently re-released book from the Francis Kaunda Foundation called Things to Remember, Not to Forget. Our guest today might need no introduction, but he is currently the chairperson of the Francis Kaunda Foundation, and he's here with us in the studio. Welcome, Mr. Elias Chipimo.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
And the pleasure is all ours to actually host you on this particular special occasion. We don't normally do book reviews, but when this book was re-released by your foundation, we felt the need that it was important that there were key nuggets in this particular book that we needed to, the public and our followers to actually get to know about. But before I get right into that, are you able to tell us a little bit about what the Francis Kaunda Foundation is all about and why it was actually set up?
Yes. First of all, it's a pleasure and a privilege for me to be part of this. I was invited by the Kaunda family to chair the foundation. And in a way, it resonated with me primarily because I've always felt that Zambia is a very young nation. And it's important that we record our contemporary history, meaning the people who have lived through critical stages of our development as a country, as a young country, if they don't reposit what they went through, then we will be an unanchored society. We won't be able to learn from the lessons of the past and understand why certain things were done. Things which, when people look back later, they might think they were strange or unusual. But when they're understood from the context of the people who lived those times and who were key decision makers around those important things that have shaped our destiny as a nation. If they don't record those things, then we will be lost. It's like you not knowing your name or where you came from. But the more you understand how you were named, why you were named that way, who you were named after, all of those things help to shape your outlook on the world. And that's something that I felt very strongly about. And so when I was approached by the family, I was very excited because I've been trying to get all the people, beyond a certain age who lived through our history to write, to leave something. And the foundation's main goals is really, one, to promote Zambian literature and to ensure that there is a greater sense of what this literature entails. Number two, it's to encourage a culture of literary engagement, especially in underserved communities. And we want to do this through scholarships. So in rural and deprived areas, getting young people to read about our own history. Number three is to encourage Zambian authorship. So that we can have many more young Zambians writing. I've written a book. I'm actually writing another one.
Really?
And I wrote this 10 years ago, really just to document my own sort of political history, but also just to explain where I see the country going. And we want to encourage other people as well. It shouldn't just be because you've reached 50, 60 years old, but even people who are 20, who are 17, they should be able to write as well. And so really those are the key reasons why this foundation has been established.
This is very, very interesting. And, obviously, many of our viewers will be very curious to know that, the book gets re-released when Zambia now has its 7th president. The book itself tells an emphatic story of, some of the things that happened during the struggle of independence, post-independence as well, and it also it touches on aspects of unity. Does the foundation believe that this is an important cause, especially now where you have perceptions of divisions in the country, etc.? What can we learn from this book that could address some of those things?
Look, this is a really important question, and I think we tend to minimize the importance of talking about what the underlying drivers of unity require. Very often we do things subconsciously and largely as a result of patterns that have been established for us. And we develop biases. And if you look at where the world is going now, there's this concept of inclusivity and diversity. It's being touted more as something that corporates are beginning to embrace, because they're realizing that their future success and their growth is going to be dependent on not being narrow-minded, but being more broad. So being more inclusive. Are they having more women in the boardroom? Are they having systems in place that can encourage minorities, people who perhaps wouldn't ordinarily have been factored into the growth plans of an organization? And this is no different for a country as well. If we're not utilizing all of the resources at our disposal so that we allow the best of what the country has to offer to come to the forefront and contribute ideas, and these ideas can come from the most unlikely places. But if we continue with our narrow approach that, look, I come from this place, and so therefore I'll promote the people in this place, or I come from this area, so I'll only look at the interests of that area, and don't bring in others to improve the underlying foundation, then we will never really grow as a nation. And the question of unity has always been at the center of how Zambia has progressed. And we can talk about this in more stark terms when we talk about ethnicity and tribal issues. And it's not that these things are wrong. They are there and they are real because that's what we're familiar with. If I come from a particular community, of course I'll have the interests of my community, just as I would have the interest of my family. But when it comes to nation building, you have to find a way of breaking that familiarity and breaking those natural barriers that can be built around familiarity with my clan, my community, my tribe, my ethnicity, in order to bring in new ideas that can help to improve. Because that's how everything develops. No culture has ever developed because it's stuck rigidly to the things that were contained within its community. There was always things that were borrowed from other places, always ideas that were borrowed, better ideas that helped to improve what happened. And so this is really why this unity question is important, especially when we look at the challenges that we're facing as a country right now. We've had the same problems over and over and over again. And it's only when we can start to say, let's look beyond tribe. Let's look even beyond political party and say, well, who is the best at addressing this issue? Doesn't matter who they are, where they come from. Let's bring their ideas to the table. And a book like this can help to remind us of what historically Zambia went through in order to achieve the great strides that it did, in the 70s post-independence. And we can recapture that, but we're only going to do it successfully if we can look at this history, understand what they did, why they did it, and pick some principles and lessons that we can apply today.
Absolutely. And, this resonates with my next question, which is actually one of my favorite chapters in the book, The Curse of the Compromised Candidate, where Francis Kaunda talks about some of the compromises that have been made in the past. And I think to a certain extent, repetitively, when it came to selecting leadership, and it could be either political or business leadership. Do you think in part this has been because of a certain desperation for change, be it at a national level or even at, in a company level, that Francis Kaunda saw?
Look, pretty much. And the interesting thing is that this idea of a compromise is not unique to Zambia. It's not unique to Africa. And in some ways, it's a trend that has emerged and engulfed the planet. It's engulfed the world. So you find it in political systems pretty much all across the full spectrum of our societies. People are not voting for a particular candidate, they're voting against a candidate. Now, it wasn't always that way, but we can revive it. And the way that you revive it, at least one way that you can revive it, is reincorporating what's important in people's lives, engaging individuals in a way that helps them to feel as though the politics will make a difference in their lives. And part of the history that Francis Kaunda records, especially when he looks at all the different candidates that emerged and why they were selected, it's important to analyze that and see that actually when you can revert to what matters for people as opposed to why somebody should not be voted for, but to focus on issue-driven agendas, then you can somehow reclaim this idea that we can be proactive and positive in what we want to see rather than negative and reactive and saying, let's get rid of. And part of it, and this is why reading is so important and why this literature is such a critical thing and why this book as an example of what can be done is very important, is because the more you know about who you are, where you came from, why things were done in a certain way, the more invested you will be in wanting to see solution-oriented approaches. And you'll start to demand that in the politicians, so that it's no longer, I'm better than this guy, but it's, this is what I'm offering to you. Because you've got a foundation of knowledge and literary awareness that helps you to question these candidates in a deeper and more meaningful way.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, I'll turn my question around Francis Kaunda, the person. I understand he was a very strong Anglican. How profound do you think his, or does the foundation think that, his love for the church and, how he carried himself spoke to, his deep-rooted love for, not only the Anglican Church, but also the country as well?
Well, the interesting thing about the late Francis Kaunda is he was a very gentle man, and in many respects a man of very few words. His father was himself a missionary in terms of his upbringing, and clearly inculcated these values in his children and his family. In fact, he himself would have probably taken up the cloth and become a church minister or a clothed representative of the church. But it was his mother who discouraged him because she could see the potential that he had to make a difference for the family, and felt that going into full-time ministry would have compromised that. So he clearly had a strong inclination, no doubt inspired by his father, but he had a clearly strong inclination to the church, to the Anglican Church, and that kept him sustained, I think, in all the things that he was made responsible for. And when you read the book, you really get a sense of how measured he was, and how focused he was on making sure that the right information emerged, so that decisions that were made on the basis of evidence rather than conjecture and speculation. And on many occasions, he'd have to intervene with the head of state, President Kaunda at the time, who had made decisions based on patchy information. Right. And Francis Kaunda would always come in at the relevant point and challenge, the understanding, and in many cases produce a completely different result, the right result. And I think that a lot of this was built on the foundation that he had within the Anglican Church.
Absolutely, and I don't think many business leaders actually do make that connection of having faith-based sort of leadership. But then, when we look at in the book itself, it does focus on his passion of ensuring that there was a lot of skills transfer, especially during his tenure at the helm of ZCCM. One does get a sense that the Zambians' first sort of phenomenon was something that was part of his DNA, as it were. Do you think, to a large extent, he was able to achieve a lot of his desires to have a lot of skills being transferred to Zambians who were working under ZCMI?
Without a doubt. I think that part of his legacy, some may question certain aspects of how they approached the issue of Zambianization, but I don't think anybody can question the commitment and focus that they felt was necessary to be applied. Now, look at all the things that they did. I mean, if you look at a lot of the talent that has emerged, and I'll give you just a simple example that came to mind recently. Mrs. Mwelwa, who has now been elected as the president of ACCA.
Yes, Zika, actually.
It's Zika.
Yes.
It is Zika.
Yes.
She went to the Chingola School of Accountancy. Mm-hmm. Now, that was established by ZCCM. Right. Under Francis Kaunda's watch. And he was very deliberate because he felt that we needed to build a cadre of capability into preparation for managerial roles, because these responsibilities were being undertaken by non-Zambians. And he saw that and realized that this was never going to be conducive for the long-term growth prospects of the country, of the economy. And communities were ultimately going to depend on the ability of individuals in society to be able to get ahead. And they couldn't do that if they weren't properly capacitated. It's just one example. I read some critique recently from former Finance Minister Nandu Magande about some of the conglomerates that were established by ZCCM at the time. You know, they had a laundry service, they had a port clearing service, and all of this kind of thing. But if you read the book critically, and it's very easy to, how can I put it? It's very easy to criticize. I mean, there's an expression, it's always easier and more gratifying to destroy rather than to construct an argument. But when you look at his justification for why this was done, it makes a lot of sense. Because what was happening is a lot of these industries were being run by foreign nationals.
Right.
And as they made their money, they were effectively externalizing it. And they were developing their own people, not developing Zambians. And it was costing ZCCM and the country a significant amount. And so what he felt was, well, if these were owned by Zambians, then that resource would remain in the country. Zambian capacity would be built and developed. But what's also really interesting, and it's something that I didn't realize until I actually read these sections in this book, is that there was a leadership code. And that leadership code, I thought, only affected people who were working for government or people who were working in the parastatals, in government-owned enterprises. But the leadership code had a threshold. If you were earning more than a certain amount of money, and at the time I think it was 2,000 kwacha, it might be the equivalent of 30, 40,000 kwacha today. But if you were earning that amount of money, you were defined as a leader for purposes of the leadership code, meaning you could not own certain assets, you couldn't do certain things. So we could never have developed an entrepreneurial culture.
Correct.
And so what ZCCM did under the leadership of Francis Kaunda was allow for that leadership culture to emerge through these institutions that may have seemed like they had nothing to do with mining and were not relevant, but they helped to build the capacity, the managerial and entrepreneurial capacity that we are able to experience today. So for me, I actually wish they'd done more of this.
Absolutely, absolutely. I know we're running out of time, but just a final question. You know, in the book, he does clear out a certain misunderstanding that many people would have regarding whether, you know, he was related to the president at the time, and he notes it jokingly that, you know, despite spelling mistakes, they were not related. But he does describe how close their working relationship was. How significant do you think that relationship was for the development of Zambia?
It's a really interesting question, and I want to expand it a little bit by saying it wasn't just significant for Zambia, it was actually significant for the region and potentially even for the continent. Because if you recall, Zambia was one of the early independent states, especially within our region. And we drew a lot of inspiration from Ghana and from Tanzania. In fact, if you see a lot of the laws that were introduced into Zambia, usually started out in Ghana, were imported by Tanzania, and it's because of the relationship that Dr. Kaunda, the president, had with Kwame Nkrumah as president of Ghana at the time, and with Julius Nyerere as president of Tanzania at the time. And that camaraderie filtered its way into what was taking place here in Zambia. And there were certain decisions that were made that Francis Kaunda was able to speak into because of his relationship with Dr. Kaunda. Now, they were not related. Dr. Kaunda, as president, actually hailed from Malawi, whereas Francis Kaunda actually hailed from Luapula. And it just happens to have been a coincidence that their names were the same. But I know for many years, even I, who should have known better, you know, growing up as a young boy, that they were not related. But somehow it always struck me as too coincidental that perhaps. And then because he was elected to jointly chair and manage the combined mining companies, what was Ron Consolidated Mines and NCCM Changa Consolidated Copper Mines, which when they were merged became ZCCM. Not ZCCMIH, but just ZCCM.
Yes, correct.
And so when he headed that, again, I think the perception was Kaunda's appointing his family member, but actually they were completely unrelated. But the nature of the relationship was such that, and this is where I related to extending beyond Zambia, it was interesting that when Dr. Kaunda, as president, made the decision that Zambia was going to be a reference point for supporting liberation movements within the region, including South Africa, it was to Francis Kaunda that he would turn to find solutions for some of the challenges that these liberation leaders were facing. So when they needed to escape potential assassinations, when they needed places to hide, when they needed support, no doubt financial and material, it was Francis Kaunda under ZCCM that responded to that challenge. And he developed such interesting and close relationships with the likes of Thabo Mbeki and others that emerged around that space, but beyond South Africa. And so that relationship that he had with the president enabled for these interactions to happen. So the impact was beyond Zambia.
I can imagine. And, from page 1 to the last page of the book, I couldn't put it down. It's such a wealth of knowledge. And I'd encourage many Zambians to actually, and even internationals, to actually read this book to get some insight. Elias Chipimo, thank you so much for joining us on this special edition of FIZ Show. We hope to host you again to discuss other issues that you're involved in later on.
It's been a real pleasure, and I think you're doing a fantastic job.
Thank you so much. This has been Mwelwa Chibesakunda, founder of Financial Insight, on a special edition of the FIZ Show, where we were sitting down with Elias Chipimo, who is the chairperson of the Francis Kaunda Foundation. Tune in for another exciting and riveting episode of the FIZ Show. Get to know.
Hi, welcome to East Park Lifestyle Studios. Come in.
Oh yeah.